Tonight, from Silent History Secrets, we invite you to drift through time. Close your eyes, slow your breath, and let the past whisper its forgotten stories. This is where history sleeps and dreams awaken. In the late 11th century, Europe was a land of stone castles and candlelight, of endless wars and deep faith. Life was harsh, uncertain, and short, but in every heart burned a longing for heaven. The church stood above all, shaping not only belief, but the rhythm of daily life. Then, in the year 1095, everything began to change. In the quiet French town of Clermont, Pope Urban I addressed a great gathering of nobles, monks, and commoners. His words carried more than passion, they carried a promise of salvation. He spoke of Jerusalem, the sacred city where Christ had walked, now under the rule of those who did not follow the Christian God. He told of desecrated churches, of altars destroyed, and of believers slaughtered. His voice rose and broke the air with a cry that would echo across centuries, Deus vult, God wills it. The crowd erupted. Knights drew their swords to the sky, peasants wept and fell to their knees. In that moment, an idea was born, a war not for land or gold, but for faith itself. The First Crusade had begun. Across the kingdoms of Europe, the call spread like wildfire. Men and women of every rank prepared to leave their homes and travel thousands of miles to a land they had only heard about in sermons. They sold fields, traded livestock, and abandoned families, believing that the road to Jerusalem was also the road to eternal life. They marched under the sign of the Red Cross sewn onto their cloaks, a symbol of both faith and blood. But the road was cruel. They crossed mountains, deserts, and seas. Many never reached their destination. Those who did arrived as ghosts of what they once were, thin, sick, and hollow-eyed. Yet when they finally stood before the walls of Jerusalem in the summer of 1099, their faith gave them strength one last time. After weeks of brutal siege, the walls fell. The Crusaders stormed the city. The victory was savage, the cost unspeakable. The streets ran red, and the air was filled with smoke, and the cries of both conquerors and the conquered. Still, in the eyes of the survivors, this was the will of God fulfilled. The holy city was theirs again. For a brief moment, it seemed like the world had changed. Jerusalem was free, and the banners of Christ flew high above its walls. But peace did not follow. The new Crusader kingdoms were fragile, surrounded by enemies, and starved of men. The soldiers who had fought so fiercely longed to go home. They had fulfilled their vows, and Europe called them back. Soon, only a handful of knights remained behind to defend an empire that stretched thin across foreign soil. Beyond the city gates, danger lurked on every road. Pilgrims from the west still came, poor, unarmed, and hopeful, to pray at the Holy Sepulchre, the tomb of Christ. They walked through deserts, forests, and war zones, carrying only faith as their shield. Many never reached Jerusalem. Some were robbed, others captured, some simply disappeared. Protecting the Holy Land was no longer just a matter of armies, it was a matter of survival. And from this growing need, something new began to form. Among the soldiers and priests who remained in the East, there were those who dreamed of a different kind of brotherhood. They were not great lords or princes, but men who believed that faith could be served not only in prayer, but also with a sword. One of them was Hugues de Payens, a minor nobleman from France. He had fought in the Crusades and seen the dangers that travelers faced. More than once, he had seen men die on the dusty roads leading to Jerusalem, pilgrims who had come in peace, only to fall prey to thieves or mercenaries. When Hugues returned home, those memories stayed with him. The church had its monks, who prayed and tended to the soul. The armies had their knights, who fought for kings and land. But there was no order that served both, no brotherhood that would live as monks but fight as soldiers, bound by holy purpose. So Hugues gathered 8 men who shared his vision. They were not many, but they were devoted. Each took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They promised to live without luxury, to own nothing, and to protect those who could not protect themselves. In the year 1119, they came before King Baldwin I of Jerusalem to offer their service. The king listened, then smiled, for he saw in them something rare, purity of purpose in a world of ambition. He granted them quarters in a place of great reverence, the Temple Mount, believed to be the site of King Solomon's ancient temple. From that moment, they became known as the Poor Fellow, soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. The name was long, but soon, people began to call them something simpler, the Knights Templar. At first, they were truly poor. Their armor was worn, their tunics plain. Legend says that two men often shared one horse. They ate together in silence, prayed before every battle, and slept on the cold stone floors of the temple. Yet from that humble beginning, something powerful began to take root. The Templars lived differently from other knights. They fought not for personal glory, but for God's will. They were disciplined, silent, and unafraid of death. In a world where most knights sought riches and fame, these men chose sacrifice. As their reputation grew, so did their numbers. More men came to join their ranks. Some gave up titles, others their fortunes. Even kings began to take notice. The Templars soon became more than just guardians of the roads. They became symbols of faith itself. By the early 12th century, whispers of their courage had reached every corner of Europe. Their white mantles, marked with a red cross, became a sign of both purity and danger. Wherever they rode, enemies trembled and believers prayed. And yet, beneath their solemn oaths and holy mission, the seeds of destiny were already being sown. Seeds that would one day bring them unimaginable power, and later, a tragic fall. For now, they were still just 9 men, bound together by faith and a dream that would soon outgrow them all. From the quiet chambers of the Temple of Solomon, the Order of the Knights Templar took its first breath, a small spark in the vast darkness of the medieval world. No one could have imagined that this spark would one day ignite across continents, shaping the course of history for centuries to come. In the years that followed the founding of the Knights Templar, the world around them began to shift. The Crusader kingdoms stood uncertain, too few knights, too much land, and enemies on every border. The pilgrims still came, walking barefoot through dust and danger, whispering prayers as they crossed the sacred roads of Palestine. And always, somewhere nearby, the Templars watched. They were few, 9 men bound by their vows, but they carried themselves with quiet dignity. Their home, built among the ancient stones of the Temple Mount, looked over Jerusalem like a silent guardian. At dawn, their chants echoed softly through the corridors. At dusk, they sharpened swords and tended to wary travelers who sought refuge under their roof. They were poor, as their name declared. Their clothing was plain, their meals simple. Their lives were ruled by silence and prayer. But in their stillness lay something new, a form of devotion that combined faith and courage in a way the world had never seen before. In the beginning, few truly understood who these men were. They were not monks, though they prayed as monks did. They were not soldiers, though they fought with the precision of trained warriors. Even among their allies, people whispered, who were these knights who claimed no land, who served no king, and yet commanded such respect? News of them spread across the Holy Land and beyond, and soon, one of the most powerful voices in Christendom would take notice. His name was Bernard of Clairvaux, a Cistercian monk known for his wisdom and his fierce devotion to the Church. He had once walked away from the comforts of nobility to build a monastery in the wilderness, living on nothing but faith and discipline. To many, he was already a saint in life, a man whose words could move armies and humble kings. When Bernard heard of the Templars, he recognized something rare. Here, at last, was a way to redeem the idea of knighthood itself. For centuries, Europe's knights had been men of pride and bloodlust, feuding endlessly for land and vengeance. But these Templars, these warrior monks, had turned their strength toward divine purpose. Bernard wrote of them with reverence, "They fight the battles of the Lord. They fear neither demons nor men. Their bodies are protected by steel, but their souls are guarded by faith." It was Bernard who first gave the order a voice. He defended them before bishops and kings, calling them the new kind of knight, gentle as lambs, yet fierce as lions. And his words changed everything. With Bernard's blessing, the Templars were invited to attend the Great Church Council of Troyes in 1129. There, beneath the vaulted ceilings of a cold French abbey, the future of the order would be decided. Representatives from across Europe gathered, cardinals, abbots, scholars, and nobles. At their head stood the papal legate, a man of the highest authority. Before them knelt Hugues de Payens and his brothers. They spoke not of glory or conquest, but of duty to protect pilgrims, to defend the Holy Land, and to live in poverty, obedience, and chastity. They asked for recognition, not as a mere brotherhood, but as a sacred order of the Church. After long hours of debate and prayer, the council reached its decision. The Knights Templar were to be recognized officially, a military order bound by religious vows. They would answer to no earthly ruler, only to the Pope himself. In that moment, the poor knights of Jerusalem became something more. They were no longer just a handful of warriors. They were a brotherhood of faith, blessed by the Church, protected by heaven, and feared by all who stood against them. The council also approved a set of rules. The Latin rule, a detailed guide for how the Templars would live and serve. It spoke of how they would pray, how they would eat, how they would ride into battle. It forbade them from hunting for sport, from boasting, from wearing bright colors or luxurious fabrics. Their horses, their armor, even their beds belonged to the order, not to any man. Everything they had was shared. When a new knight joined, he swore his oath before God and his brothers. He vowed to live in purity and to defend the weak. Then he received his mantle, white for purity, marked with a red cross for sacrifice. It was a simple ceremony, but to those who witnessed it, it felt like witnessing a new faith being born. The white cloak of the Templars soon became one of the most recognizable symbols of the medieval world, pure, striking, and unforgettable. As years passed, the order began to grow. Men came from every corner of Europe to join them. Some were nobles seeking redemption. Others were peasants drawn by faith and purpose. Many gave up their land and wealth, donating everything they owned to support the order's mission. In return, they received no riches, no titles, and no freedom, only the brotherhood of men who lived and died by their vows. With each passing year, the Templars gained not only strength but trust. Kings and popes began to see them as the protectors of Christendom. The Pope himself granted them extraordinary privileges. They could build their own churches, bury their own dead, and collect their own taxes. No bishop or noble could command them. No king could claim their property. The order now stood apart from every power on earth. Their allegiance was to faith alone. But even as their influence grew, the Templars remained disciplined. They built fortresses across the Holy Land, strongholds of stone and silence, where they trained, prayed, and prepared for the endless wars to come. They did not seek glory. They sought only to serve. Those who met them often spoke of their calm. In battle, they did not shout. They moved as one, silent, relentless, their white mantles flashing beneath the desert sun. When others fled, the Templars stood firm. When others despaired, they prayed. It was said that one Templar was worth 10 ordinary knights, not because of his strength, but because of his faith. They believed death was not an end, but a passage, that falling in battle for the defense of the Holy Land was the truest form of worship. And so the legend began to spread. Across Europe, children whispered their name. In markets and taverns, people told stories of the warrior monks of Jerusalem, holy men who fought without fear, who carried swords in one hand and the cross in the other. The world had never seen anything like them before. And though they did not know it yet, their destiny would soon take them beyond battlefields and prayers into realms of power, gold, and mystery that would one day make them both revered and condemned. Jerusalem at dawn was a city of contrasts. From the high terraces of the Temple Mount, the first light touched domes and towers built from pale stone. Beyond the walls, the desert stretched into the horizon, endless, quiet, and cruel. Inside the city, bells called the faithful to prayer. In those early years, the Knights Templar lived not as legends, but as humble servants of a cause few yet understood. Their quarters were simple chambers built beside what was once the Temple of Solomon, the holiest ground in all of Jerusalem. The building had long been transformed and rebuilt by empires that came and went, but the stones still carried an ancient weight. To the Templars, this place was more than home. It was a symbol of the covenant between heaven and earth. Every morning, they woke before sunrise to pray. Their voices rose softly, echoing through the marble halls. After prayer, they ate bread and watered wine in silence. Then they tended their horses, mended their armor, or rode out to guard the pilgrim roads that wound across the desert. They had no riches, no titles, and few comforts. But they had something greater, a sense of divine purpose. Every step, every sword stroke, every breath was a prayer. The 9 founding knights, Hugues de Payens and his 8 companions, were a strange sight among the great armies of the Crusades. They carried no banners of kings, no family crests or golden emblems. They wore plain white mantles marked only by a small red cross over the heart. Wherever they rode, people noticed their calm. They did not boast. They did not argue. They simply worked. It was said that 2 men often shared a single horse. This image, 2 knights riding one steed, became the symbol of their vow of poverty and brotherhood. It was carved into seals, painted on parchment, and whispered about across Europe. To some, it was a sign of humility. To others, a mystery, a riddle of loyalty and faith. In time, the Templars' presence in Jerusalem began to draw attention. Merchants saw them escorting caravans through the desert. Pilgrims spoke of them in wonder, telling stories of how these silent knights appeared on the horizon when danger came, driving away bandits or leading the lost to safety. To the weary and frightened, they seemed almost angelic. The king of Jerusalem himself began to rely on them. When word spread that Hugues and his men guarded the roads and kept peace in the holy city, more pilgrims arrived. Trade grew, confidence returned, and with it came the first donations, small gifts from grateful travelers, then lands and coin from nobles who heard of their deeds. Yet for all their growing reputation, the Templars themselves remained unchanged. They still lived in the Temple Mount, sleeping on straw mats, eating in silence, and praying at every dawn and dusk. Hugues de Payens often reminded them, "We are not of this world. We do not fight for gold or crowns. We fight for the safety of God's people." Still, the Temple Mount itself held mysteries that stirred the imagination of all who visited. It was said that within its ancient foundations lay hidden tunnels and chambers, relics of King Solomon's time. The Templars were granted permission to explore those underground halls. What they found there, if anything, was never written down. But rumors began to spread, whispers that they had uncovered ancient knowledge or sacred relics lost for centuries. Some said they discovered fragments of the Ark of the Covenant. Others believed they had found scrolls from the time of Solomon himself. None of it was ever proven. The Templars never spoke of what they found, and the silence only deepened the mystery. Even their harshest critics, centuries later, could not ignore how quickly the order's influence grew after their years beneath the temple. It was as if they had unearthed more than just stones, as if they had drawn strength from something hidden beneath the very heart of Jerusalem. By the 1130s, the small band of knights had become a force recognized throughout the Christian world. Their courage, their discipline, and their devotion made them indispensable in the fragile Crusader states. But even as they became known for their strength in battle, their true legacy lay elsewhere, in the structure they built, the rule they followed, and the way they inspired others to live. They were unlike any other knights. Each man followed a strict code to obey without question, to show no fear, and to never retreat unless commanded. When they rode into battle, they formed an unbreakable line. If one fell, another took his place. To them, death was not failure but fulfillment, the final act of service to God. Their courage inspired not only soldiers, but also common people. Stories spread across Europe of Templars who fought 10 against 100 and survived, or who refused to surrender even when surrounded. Children in distant villages played games pretending to be Templar knights, standing tall with wooden swords and whispering prayers before charging through fields. But the Templars' growing fame also brought attention from those who sought to use them. Lords and princes began to see the order as more than protectors. They were tools of power. And so the gifts became larger: manors, vineyards, entire estates. Each gift was meant to help fund the defense of the Holy Land, but also served to bind the Templars to the politics of kings. The brothers accepted these donations with humility, but always reminded the donors that their wealth was no one's to claim. All property given to the order became sacred, used not for comfort, but for the mission. Every coin, every grain of wheat, every sword sent to Jerusalem was carefully recorded. Their honesty and efficiency would one day make them the most trusted financiers in Europe. But that part of the story was still to come. For now, they remained the guardians of the Holy City, 9 knights sworn to protect the innocent, united by faith stronger than iron. Hugues de Payens lived long enough to see the order he founded grow from a small brotherhood into a movement that stretched across continents. He died in the mid-1130s, far from the deserts he had once ridden through, but his vision endured. After his passing, his brothers carried his mantle into every corner of Christendom. They built fortresses, trained new recruits, and spread the ideals of duty, purity, and sacrifice. No one then could have imagined what they would become. The world saw only warriors, holy men with swords. But within a century, they would hold the trust of kings, control the wealth of empires, and command fleets that sailed the Mediterranean. The 9 humble knights of the Temple of Solomon had planted a seed that would grow beyond anything they could have dreamed. And deep within the shadows of their sacred halls, legends began to form, whispers of hidden treasures, forbidden knowledge, and oaths that would one day test the very soul of Christendom. By the middle of the 12th century, the Knights Templar had already become a presence no one could ignore. From their humble beginnings on the Temple Mount, they had spread across the Crusader kingdoms, their white mantles visible in every fortress, caravan route, and battlefield of the Holy Land. Their faith was their armor, their discipline their weapon. But to survive in a land forever at war, faith alone was not enough. They had to learn to fight with the precision of soldiers and the resolve of saints. Life in the order was strict and unyielding. Each Templar rose before dawn to pray. Their day began not with words of comfort, but with the sound of armor being fastened, hooves being saddled, and swords drawn for inspection. After prayer came training. They practiced riding in formation, charging together as one, and turning their lances with perfect timing. Every movement was a lesson in obedience. They trained not for glory, but for duty. They were told, when you ride into battle, think not of victory, but of service. They did not retreat, even when death seemed certain. To die defending the faith was not tragedy, it was triumph. Unlike ordinary knights, who often dressed in gold or velvet, the Templars wore simple white tunics. Their only decoration was the red cross stitched over the heart, a mark of sacrifice. It reminded them that their blood, if shed, was a gift to God. The Holy Land, though sacred, was unforgiving. The Templars fought not only enemies but hunger, heat, and exhaustion. They guarded the roads from Jaffa to Jerusalem, escorting pilgrims under the scorching sun. When attacked by desert raiders, they fought swiftly and without hesitation. Many died nameless on those lonely roads, their graves marked only by a cross of stones. Yet even in the harshest moments, their faith did not falter. They prayed before every battle and gave thanks after every victory or defeat. They believed God's will was not measured in triumphs, but in courage. It was during these years that the Templars forged their bond with another figure who would shape their destiny, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard had already become a legend in Europe, a monk whose words carried more power than any sword. He wrote and spoke with fire, calling for purity in an age of greed and corruption. When he heard of the Templars, warrior monks who lived as simply as the poorest brothers, he saw in them a divine answer to the Church's greatest question: could violence ever be holy? To Bernard, the Templars were proof that it could. They fought, yes, but for no king, no coin, and no earthly ambition. Their only master was God. He defended them fiercely against those who doubted that men could both kill and pray. In his famous work, De Laude Novi Militia, in praise of the new knighthood, he wrote, "They go into battle unafraid, for they seek not glory, but salvation. They are mild to the faithful, merciless to the infidel. When they strike, they do so with a pure heart." His words spread across Europe like light through stained glass. The Templars were no longer seen as an odd brotherhood of poor knights, but as divine instruments of God's will. With Bernard's blessing, the Church fully embraced them. Their white mantles now carried not only the cross, but the Church's approval. The Pope granted them privileges unlike any other order. They could travel freely across borders. They were subject only to papal authority. No bishop or king could tax them, judge them, or command them. This freedom made them powerful, and power always draws attention. But the early Templars were careful. Their strength lay in unity, not ambition. They built fortresses across the Holy Land, strong, simple structures that served as both monasteries and military bases. Within their thick stone walls, they prayed, trained, and prepared for the next campaign. Their discipline made them different from the armies of feudal lords, where men often fought for spoils. A Templar fought not for wealth, but because he had sworn to do so. Over time, their presence began to turn the tide of battle. In skirmishes across the desert, they were often the first to charge and the last to retreat. Their courage became legendary. One chronicler wrote that when the enemies saw the white cloaks of the Templars approaching, even the boldest warriors hesitated. For these men did not fear death, they embraced it. And in a time when courage often faltered before fear, that made them unstoppable. The Muslim chroniclers, too, took note of their ferocity. Some called them the White Lions, others the Monks of War. They learned to respect the Templars even as they fought them. But the Templars were more than soldiers. When not in battle, they served as protectors and builders. They repaired roads, offered food to pilgrims, and built hospitals for the sick. They maintained outposts where travelers could rest safely, an invisible network of sanctuaries stretching from the coast to the gates of Jerusalem. Their presence gave people courage to travel again. Trade began to grow. The roads became safer, the Holy Land more connected. Where others saw endless war, the Templars built stability, and in doing so, they became indispensable. Faith, however, was always at the heart of everything they did. At night, after long days of battle or labor, they gathered in prayer. Their chaplains reminded them that pride was their greatest enemy. They confessed their sins openly before their brothers. And when one of them died, the others prayed over his body, believing that he had merely passed through the final gate of service. This constant rhythm, prayer, discipline, humility, forged them into something the world had never seen, a brotherhood that blended the sword and the cross, turning both into instruments of devotion. They did not call themselves saints. They were men, flawed, mortal, often wary. But through their unity, they built a legend. And that legend began to spread like fire through Europe. Nobles and kings soon sent sons in gold to join their ranks. Entire estates were donated in France, England, and Spain to support their mission. The Templars accepted these gifts not as rewards, but as tools, resources to fund their work in the East. Their organization grew more structured, their command more precise. From the deserts of Palestine to the forests of Europe, the white mantle became a sign of order, discipline, and faith unbroken. Yet even as they rose in glory, the seeds of their eventual downfall were already being planted. For every kingdom that admired them, there were others that feared their independence. They had no allegiance but to God, and that made them both powerful and untouchable, a dangerous combination in a world ruled by ambition. But that is a tale for another time. For now, in the blazing sun of the 12th century, the Templars stood unshaken, a new kind of warrior, their swords guided by faith, their hearts set upon heaven. By the middle of the 12th century, the symbol of the Red Cross had begun to spread across Europe, a simple crimson mark stitched upon a white mantle, worn over armor that gleamed in the sun. To the common people, it was a sign of divine protection. To the soldiers of Islam, it was the mark of an enemy who did not fear death. The Templars had come far since their humble beginnings beside the Temple Mount. What began as 9 knights sworn to protect pilgrims had become a vast brotherhood stretching from Jerusalem to the farthest corners of Christendom. Their fame had grown, and with it, their purpose. No longer just guardians of the road, they had become the shield of the Holy Land, an army unlike any other, bound not by the promises of kings, but by the vow of faith. Their white cloaks, pure as the ideal they served, bore the red cross sewn over the heart. It was not a decoration, nor a mark of rank. It was a symbol of blood and sacrifice, the blood of Christ, and the blood they were willing to shed in his name. To wear it was an honor that few achieved easily. When a man wished to join the Templars, he faced long days of testing. His past was examined, his motives questioned. The order rejected those who sought wealth, revenge, or fame. Only those whose hearts were pure, whose faith was unshaken, were accepted. When the time came, the new brother was brought before the chapter of knights. The hall was silent. Torches flickered on stone walls as he knelt upon the floor. He swore obedience, chastity, and poverty. He promised to live and die in the service of God and the temple. Then, the master of the order placed a white mantle upon his shoulders and whispered, "Receive this cloak of purity. From this day, you are one of us." The man would rise not as an individual, but as a Templar, his former life erased, his name known only to God. The Templars' numbers swelled. Their discipline, courage, and faith made them invaluable to the fragile Crusader kingdoms. When armies faltered, the Templars stood firm. When hope seemed lost, they became the rallying point. In battle, they carried no bright banners or golden emblems, only the red cross upon white cloth, fluttering like flame in the wind. They fought with silence and precision. Before a charge, they prayed. When the trumpet sounded, they rode as one. Their lances struck with such force that enemies spoke of them as an unstoppable tide. To them, death held no fear. Before each battle, they confessed their sins, received absolution, and mounted their horses knowing that, should they fall, heaven awaited. One chronicler wrote, "The Templars charge as if the gates of paradise were before them, and death itself stood aside to let them pass." But the Templars were more than warriors. Between battles, they worked as builders, protectors, and administrators. They constructed massive fortresses along the frontiers, strongholds of faith and stone, built to withstand sieges and storms alike. Each fortress was both monastery and military base, where men prayed trained and lived in strict obedience. Some of these fortresses, like the great Krak des Chevaliers in Syria, would later become symbols of medieval might, rising from the landscape like mountains of carved rock. But the Templars did not build for glory. Their castles were not palaces. They were sanctuaries designed for endurance and defense, not comfort. Inside the thick walls, every hour had its purpose. They ate together at long wooden tables. They prayed at dawn, at midday, and at dusk. They spoke little, worked hard, and slept on straw beds. Luxury was forbidden, even for their highest officers. In every act, from battle to silence, they sought only to serve. Their power grew, not through conquest, but through trust. Pilgrims across Europe and the East came to rely on the Templars not only for protection, but for honesty. The order became known for its discipline, its fairness, and its incorruptibility. In a world of corruption and chaos, they were something new, men whose word was as solid as the walls they built. A knight could ride for weeks through strange lands and never fear betrayal if a Templar house lay along his road. A poor traveler could find shelter in their halls, food at their tables, and safety under their banners. The Red Cross became more than a mark of war. It became a sign of trust, and Europe noticed. Kings began to send their sons to serve among the Templars, either in battle or as penance for their sins. Nobles gave land and gold, asking only that prayers be said for their souls. Even merchants, inspired by faith, donated portions of their earnings. Soon, Templar commanderies, small self-sufficient communities, appeared in every corner of Europe. In the fields of France, the forests of England, the coasts of Portugal, and the mountains of Spain, each one mirrored the discipline of the Holy Land, modest, ordered, and efficient. From these distant outposts flowed men, money, and supplies that kept the Crusader states alive. The growing wealth of the order was unlike any the Church had seen. Yet within the Templar walls, gold did not glitter. Every coin was recorded, every resource accounted for. Nothing belonged to an individual, not even a sword or a horse. All belonged to the order, and through the order, to God. Still, their success drew attention, admiration from some, suspicion from others. The Templars were not bound by any king's authority. They answered only to the Pope, which made them both sacred and untouchable. Many rulers found comfort in their protection, while others saw in them a power that could not easily be controlled. But for now, no one dared challenge them. Their reputation was too great, their purpose too pure. They were defenders of the faith, soldiers of God's justice, and the world revered them. In the Holy Land, their ranks swelled with new recruits. Their banners flew beside those of kings and princes. Their fortresses stretched from Jerusalem to the edges of Syria. They fought, prayed, and endured, symbols of devotion in an age that hung between light and darkness. Wherever the Red Cross appeared, people whispered blessings. To some, it meant protection. To others, it was a reminder of sacrifice. And to those who fought against it, it was a sign of death. But to the Knights Templar themselves, it meant something deeper still. It was the mark of a vow to live in purity, to fight without fear, and to die without regret. The world began to call them the Order of the Red Cross, though they never claimed the name themselves. To them, they were still simply the poor fellow, soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, servants of a faith greater than any kingdom. And under the shadow of their crimson cross, the legend of the Templars continued to grow, a legend that would soon carry them beyond the battlefields of the Holy Land, into the courts and treasuries of Europe, where power would take on a new and dangerous meaning. By the mid-12th century, the Holy Land stood balanced between triumph and peril. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem gleamed like a jewel under the desert sun, yet its brilliance hid deep cracks. The Templars, once a small brotherhood of 9, had become the unshakable backbone of its defense. They stood guard not only over pilgrims and roads, but over the very heart of Christendom in the East. From their fortress on the Temple Mount, they watched over the holy city, its narrow streets filled with the calls of merchants, the prayers of monks, and the footfalls of weary travelers who had come from across the world. For those pilgrims, Jerusalem was the end of a lifetime's journey. For the Templars, it was their sacred duty, the city they had vowed to protect with their blood. Each morning, before the heat of day, the knights gathered in silence. The air was cool, filled with the scent of incense and olive oil lamps. They prayed together, asking for strength and mercy. Afterward, the city gates opened, and the day began, caravans departing toward Jaffa, pilgrims arriving in dusty robes, soldiers riding out to patrol the valleys beyond. The Templars' presence made Jerusalem feel safe. Their calm discipline reassured the fearful. Their white mantles were like moving walls of faith among the crowds. Children followed them with curious eyes. Merchants bowed as they passed. They had become both warriors and symbols, a living reminder that the holy city still belonged to Christendom. But safety was fragile. Beyond the hills, rival armies gathered. The surrounding kingdoms of Islam, fractured yet unbroken, watched Jerusalem with patience and purpose. To them, the city was not lost, merely waiting to be reclaimed. The Templars understood this truth better than anyone. They had learned that the Holy Land could never truly rest. Every road, every fortress, every border was a promise that needed defending. And so they guarded not only Jerusalem, but the entire network of outposts that fed its lifeblood, the castles that rose like sentinels over the desert. Each fortress was a masterpiece of medieval design, thick walls, deep wells, hidden tunnels, and narrow gates built to withstand siege and storm. Inside those walls, the life of a Templar followed the same rhythm as in the city: prayer, work, and vigilance. No laughter echoed through those halls. They were places of solemn duty, where silence was a virtue and sacrifice an expectation. Among the most famous of their strongholds was the fortress of Gaza, built to guard the southern route from Egypt. Another stood at Tortosa, overlooking the coast. Further north lay Safed, a towering castle built high in the Galilean hills. And on the frontier, near the Great Plains of Syria, stood Krakdaz Chevaliers, a fortress so strong that it was said no army could break its walls. In these bastions, the Templars lived between two worlds, the sacred and the violent. They prayed as monks and fought as soldiers. They knew that death could come at any moment, yet they faced it with serenity, believing their souls already belonged to heaven. As the years passed, the Templars became the heartbeat of Jerusalem's defense. When kings quarreled or nobles hesitated, it was the Templars who acted. They were trusted more than any army, for their loyalty was unshaken. They fought not for crowns but for vows. When pilgrims were attacked, the Templars were the first to respond. When cities were threatened, they rode to reinforce the walls. Their banners became a rallying cry across the Crusader states, a red cross on a white field, visible even through clouds of dust and fire. One chronicler wrote that when the Templars charged, the earth itself seemed to tremble. They advanced in silence, a line of white cloaks cutting through chaos. To their enemies, they appeared unstoppable. To their allies, they were a living miracle. In 1147, the Second Crusade began. Once again, Europe answered the call to defend the Holy Land. Kings marched from France and Germany, accompanied by priests, nobles, and peasants. But unlike the first Crusaders, these men were not united by fire and faith. Their numbers were vast, but their purpose scattered. When they reached the east, confusion reigned. Armies clashed without strategy, alliances broke, and the deserts devoured them. The Templars, disciplined and relentless, became the one force capable of restoring order. They led troops through dangerous terrain, organized supplies, and defended the retreating soldiers when everything else failed. Though the crusade itself ended in disappointment, the Templars' reputation only grew stronger. Even kings admitted that without them, the losses would have been far greater. And so their role in the Holy Land deepened, not just as warriors, but as the guardians of Christendom's most sacred cause. Back in Jerusalem, their influence could be felt everywhere. Templar engineers built roads, wells, and bridges. Their commanderies supplied food and medicine. They created a sense of stability in a world constantly at war. Their fortress on the Temple Mount became a center of power and strategy. Within its thick walls, the Grand Master and his officers met to plan the defense of the kingdom. Messengers came and went, carrying letters sealed with the Templar cross, orders, alliances, and reports sent across thousands of miles. They were no longer just knights. They had become administrators, diplomats, and architects. Their reach extended across oceans and kingdoms, connecting east and west in ways no one else could. And yet, for all their strength, the Templars were not untouched by doubt. Some wondered if endless war could truly serve the will of God. Others saw how wealth and power began to creep into the order, even if cloaked in humility. There were whispers, faint, uneasy, that the purity of the temple might one day be tested. But for now, those doubts were distant shadows. In Jerusalem, the Templars still walked the streets as living symbols of faith and courage. Their white cloaks glowed in the sunlight, their red crosses bright as blood. When they prayed, the city seemed to breathe easier. When they rode, people felt safe. They had become the guardians, not just of Jerusalem's walls, but of its spirit. And though no one could know it then, the peace they worked so hard to protect would soon shatter in ways that would test even their unbreakable resolve. For the desert was stirring again, and far beyond the horizon, a new leader was rising. His name would soon be spoken in fear and awe across Christendom, Salah ad-Din, the one the West would call Saladin. The 12th century was an age of stone and vision. Across the vast lands that connected Europe to the Holy Land, the Knights Templar were no longer just warriors of faith. They had become builders of a new world. The war for Jerusalem had changed them. Years of battle had taught them the value of strength and endurance. But peace, when it came, demanded something different: stability, order, and wisdom. The Templars were prepared for that too. From the deserts of Palestine to the forests of France, they began to weave a web of commanderies, fortresses, and farms, a network that connected the spiritual heart of their mission in Jerusalem to the fields and villages of Europe. These houses of the temple became the backbone of their world. Each was self-sufficient, disciplined, and governed by the same strict rule. Together, they formed the largest and most efficient organization Christendom had ever seen. In the Holy Land, the Templars continued to build. Their fortresses rose like mountains of stone across the horizon, places of refuge and defense that seemed almost eternal. They built with purpose. Each wall, each arch, each stairway was designed to withstand siege and time. Their architecture was plain yet powerful, marked by symmetry and silence. There were no gold decorations, no carvings of saints. For the Templars, beauty was found in strength and function. One chronicler wrote, "Their castles stand as prayers in stone." Indeed, they were. Within those walls, men lived by prayer and by the sword, believing that to build a fortress for God was as holy as to fight for him. But their influence was not limited to the East. In Europe, their estates began to flourish. A Templar commandery was a world of order, fields neatly plowed, mills turning with the wind, vineyards stretching across hillsides. Brothers worked side by side with farmers and laborers. They grew wheat, raised livestock, produced wine, and stored grain. Everything was recorded, everything had purpose. The profits from these lands were not hoarded. They were sent eastward, funding the defense of the Holy Land. This network allowed them to move men, money, and information faster than any kingdom or church official could imagine. Messengers rode from London to Jerusalem without delay, protected by the Templar seal. Letters carried news of kings, wars, and crusades, and the brothers of the temple knew more about the world than most rulers did. As their organization grew, so did their respect among nations. Kings and popes trusted them to manage estates, store wealth, and even mediate disputes. Their honesty and discipline were legendary. A man could entrust his fortune to a Templar preceptory and know it would be safe. Merchants could travel across borders under the protection of the Templar cross, carrying nothing but a letter, a promise of gold that would be paid at their destination. It was a quiet revolution. Without realizing it, the Templars had created one of the first international financial systems in history, a way to move wealth safely through a dangerous world. Their houses in London, Paris, and Venice became early banks, guarded by knights rather than clerks. The same men who fought at Haddon and Jerusalem now counted coins, recorded debts, and balanced ledgers by candlelight. They were soldiers, monks, and financiers, a combination no one had ever seen before. Yet, for all their success, they never abandoned their vows. Every brother, whether he commanded a castle or a farm, followed the same rule: obedience, poverty, chastity, and silence. No man in the order owned anything. Even their weapons, armor, and horses belonged to God through the temple. Each day began with prayer and ended with reflection. Even in Europe, far from the deserts of the Holy Land, the rhythm of their lives followed the same sacred pattern, a life built upon humility and purpose. But as their power grew, so did the weight of their responsibilities. Kings who borrowed from them began to rely on them. Popes who blessed them began to need them. And though the Templars sought no throne, they found themselves entangled in the politics of every realm. They had become too useful to ignore and too independent to control. In the East, meanwhile, a storm was gathering. The fragile peace between Crusader and Saracen had begun to crumble. New leaders were rising among the Muslim states, strong, disciplined men who sought to reclaim what their fathers had lost. Foremost among them was Saladin, a name that would soon strike fear into every Christian heart. While the Templars built and fortified, Saladin united the divided Muslim armies under his banner. Where the Crusader lords bickered and schemed, he preached unity and patience. The desert tribes that had once fought each other now followed a single cause: to retake Jerusalem. The Templars knew what was coming. From their towers and watchposts, they could see the signs: caravans of soldiers moving through the valleys, banners gathering at the horizon. They sent word to the kings of Europe, warning them of the danger, but few listened. The West had grown comfortable. Jerusalem, it seemed, was safe. And that illusion would soon cost them dearly. Still, the Templars continued their work. They strengthened fortresses, trained recruits, and prepared for what they knew must come. Each new brother swore the same vow: to defend the Holy Land to his last breath. When asked if they feared being outnumbered, a Templar commander once replied, "We do not count our enemies. We count our prayers." That quiet confidence defined them. Even as enemies grew stronger, they held their ground, believing that every wall they built, every pilgrim they protected, was a stone laid in the eternal city of God. Their lives were not their own. They built not for glory but for faith, and in doing so, they created a world that would outlast even their fall. By the end of the 12th century, the Templars had become the most disciplined and efficient force in all Christendom. They were warriors, builders, farmers, and bankers, bound by vows but commanding influence across continents. Their red cross was now a symbol recognized from the sands of Egypt to the cathedrals of Paris. They had built roads where none existed, brought peace to lands torn by war, and turned faith into structure. They were, in every sense, the builders of a new world. But even the strongest walls cannot hold forever. Beyond their borders, the desert wind carried the sound of war once more, and the rise of Saladin would soon bring the Templars to their greatest test and their darkest hour. By the late 12th century, the Knights Templar were no longer known only as warriors of faith. Across Europe, they had become something even more remarkable: the trusted stewards of kings, nobles, and merchants alike. They were the men to whom even the most powerful rulers turned when they needed safety, secrecy, or gold. People began to call them the bankers of God. It was not a title they sought, but one that history placed upon them. For while they fought to defend the Holy Land with their swords, they also built a system that would transform the way the world understood trust, wealth, and power. The idea had begun simply. A pilgrim from France might set out for Jerusalem, his heart full of faith, but his purse heavy with coins. To carry gold across mountains and seas was dangerous. Bandits lurked on every road, and fortune invited death. So, instead of risking his life, the pilgrim would visit a Templar commandery before he departed. There, a Templar clerk would take his money, record the amount carefully in the order's ledger, and hand him a parchment bearing the seal of the temple, a simple document of promise. When the pilgrim arrived months later in the Holy Land, he could visit another Templar house and present his parchment. The brothers there would read the record, match it to the books, and give him his gold again, less a small fee for the service. It was a miracle of trust. No other organization could have made it possible, for no other was bound by such strict vows of honesty. The word of a Templar was worth more than any king's coin. From that humble system, the Templars built something vast, their network of commanderies across Europe, and the East became an invisible thread that connected the Christian world. Wealth flowed through their hands, not for their own gain, but to fund crusades, build fortresses, and protect the faithful. They became the guardians of royal treasuries. Kings entrusted them with gold, documents, and even regalia, knowing that no thief would ever breach a Templar vault. Their fortresses doubled as strongholds and financial centers, places where coin, jewels, and sacred relics were kept under divine protection. It was said that the temple in Paris, their grand headquarters in France, contained more treasure than the royal palace itself. There, in quiet chambers guarded by silent brothers, ledgers were written by candlelight, precise records of every coin given, every debt owed, every tithe collected for the Holy Land. But unlike the greedy moneylenders of the time, the Templars did not see wealth as an end. For them, money was simply another weapon in the defense of faith. The Templars' efficiency amazed even their critics. Where others relied on chance or corruption, the temple relied on discipline. Their accounts were exact, their archives organized, and their rules unbending. No brother could handle money alone. Always two, sometimes three, were present, each bound by oath to watch the other. Every coin was counted, every parchment sealed with wax. Their ledgers were written in a script few could read, and their ciphers were known only to the highest ranks of the order. Through this structure, they built something astonishing, a system of international finance centuries ahead of its time. Letters of credit allowed merchants to trade across continents. Loans to kings funded wars and construction of cathedrals. Even the Pope himself borrowed from the temple. The Knights had become, in a sense, the backbone of Christendom's economy. Yet this success brought a subtle change. The Templars had always been men of faith and discipline, but as their influence grew, the line between divine duty and worldly power began to blur. Some brothers now worked more with ink and parchment than with sword and shield. Their halls echoed not with the clatter of armor, but with the quiet scratch of quills. To the outside world, the temple seemed untouchable, rich, respected, and blessed by heaven. But within its walls, a few began to wonder whether so much wealth could truly remain pure. Could gold ever serve God without corrupting men? Hugues de Payens and the First Brothers had vowed to own nothing, to live in poverty. Now, the order they founded held lands and treasure that rivaled kings. Still, their rule remained strict. No individual knight owned a single coin. Every possession, from sword to tunic, belonged to the temple. Even the Grand Master lived under the same vows of simplicity. But the perception outside the order was different. To many, the Templars had become mysterious and frightening, monks who fought like warriors and handled gold like merchants. Their independence from all earthly authority made them both admired and resented. In the Holy Land, meanwhile, the need for money was endless. Fortresses needed rebuilding. Armies needed feeding. The defense of Jerusalem was expensive, and the kings who ruled there were often deep in debt. The Templars became the saviors of the Crusader states, lending gold to rulers who would otherwise have fallen. Their vaults funded everything from military campaigns to church restorations. In return, they received land, privileges, and influence. They never sought to rule, but their reach grew quietly, deeper than any army could march, farther than any king's decree could travel. It was said that a message sealed with the Templar cross could pass through 5 kingdoms without being opened. Their word, their seal, their network, it all commanded respect and fear in equal measure. By the year 1170, the temple's power was at its height. They had commanderies in every corner of Europe, fleets that carried supplies across the Mediterranean, and fortresses that guarded the roads of the Holy Land. They could move men and gold faster than anyone else in Christendom. And yet, for all their power, their purpose never changed. They still prayed before dawn, still followed the same vows, still believed they were instruments of divine will. To them, wealth was not a sin, it was a tool entrusted to them by God to defend the faith. They were warriors, yes, but also shepherds of resources that sustained the fragile dream of Jerusalem. And for a time, it worked. The world admired them, kings depended on them, and even their enemies respected their discipline. But the higher they rose, the thinner the air became. For in every age, great power brings great envy, and the temple's gold would one day draw the gaze of those who saw not faith, but fortune. For now, though their story was still one of triumph, in a world of war and greed, the Templars stood apart, guardians of both soul and silver, protectors of both heaven and earth. They were the bankers of God, and the world trusted them completely. Soon, however, that trust would be tested by blood and fire. For across the desert, Saladin's banners were rising, and the fate of Jerusalem was about to turn. The world the Templars had built was balanced on 2 foundations, faith and fortune. One bound them to heaven, their vows, their prayers, their obedience. The other bound them to earth, their castles, their gold, their growing influence over kings and popes alike. For a time, the 2 forces lived in harmony. But as the 12th century drew to a close, the line between them began to blur. The Templars were no longer the poor knights who shared horses on the dusty roads to Jerusalem. They had become an order of power, disciplined, efficient, and wealthy beyond imagination. Their name inspired both reverence and fear. To the faithful, they were heroes of God. To the envious, they were men of secrets. In the Holy Land, the struggle between Christian and Muslim forces had grown fiercer than ever. The Crusader kingdoms were surrounded, small islands of stone and faith in a sea of enemies. And at their borders, a single name echoed through the desert like a storm: Saladin. He had risen from the sands of Egypt, patient, brilliant, and merciful yet unyielding. Unlike the quarrelsome lords of the West, he united his people under one cause. To the Muslims, he was a savior. To the Crusaders, a shadow of destiny approaching. The Templars respected him, even as they prepared to fight him. He was a man of honor, they said, one who prayed as they did, who fought not for greed, but for belief. Yet their paths were destined to clash. In the summer of 1187, that clash came. It began near a place called Hattin, a hill crowned with twin peaks overlooking the plains of Galilee. There, the Christian army, knights from every corner of Europe, led by King Guy of Jerusalem, faced Saladin's forces under the burning sun. The Templars rode at the front, proud and fearless, their red crosses gleaming in the light. But the battle was doomed from the start. Saladin had trapped them far from water. For 2 days, the Crusaders marched through heat and smoke, their throats dry, their strength fading. By the time the battle began, the flames of exhaustion had already claimed them. The Templars charged again and again, But the desert swallowed them. Their horses fell. Their banners burned. When the dust settled, thousands lay dead. The great army of Christendom had been destroyed. Among the captives were many Templars. Saladin, it is said, offered mercy to the nobles and the wounded. But when he came to the Templars and the Hospitallers, he paused. He knew who they were, the hardest fighters, the most relentless defenders of Jerusalem. They would never surrender. And so, one by one, they were executed on the sands of Hattin, their faith unbroken to the end. In the weeks that followed, the Holy Land fell piece by piece. Cities that had stood for decades surrendered without a fight. The Templar fortresses held as long as they could, but they were too few, too far apart. And then the unthinkable happened. Jerusalem fell. Saladin entered the city not as a destroyer, but as a conqueror with mercy. He forbade looting, spared the churches, and allowed Christians to leave in peace if they paid ransom. Even the Templars, those who survived, were treated with a grim respect. But their hearts were broken. The city they had sworn to defend, the heart of their order, the purpose of their vows, was gone. In Europe, the news struck like thunder. Kings trembled, popes wept, and the people cried out for another crusade. But the world had changed. The fire that had once burned so bright in the hearts of men had dimmed. Still, the Templars did not waver. They gathered what forces remained, rebuilt their fortresses along the coast, and prepared for the next holy war. They did not mourn, they endured. Their discipline became their salvation. And soon, a new leader rose among the kings of the West, Richard the Lionheart of England, whose courage and ferocity would carry the Third Crusade across the seas. When Richard arrived in the Holy Land, it was the Templars who guided him. They knew the land better than any man alive, every pass, every spring, every fortress that could still be held. They fought beside him at Acre, Jaffa, and Arsuf. At Arsuf, it was the Templar charge that broke Saladin's lines and turned the tide of battle. Though Jerusalem was never recaptured, the Templars had restored something almost as valuable: hope. They built new castles along the coast and fortified the remaining cities. The Holy Land, though smaller, still lived. For another century, the Templars would hold the line between East and West, an unbroken chain of fortresses, prayers, and courage. But even as they rebuilt in the East, their role in the West continued to expand. Their European commanderies grew wealthier, their influence deeper. Kings borrowed from them to fund wars. Nobles deposited fortunes for safekeeping. In some regions, the Templars became more trusted than the crown itself. They had achieved what no other order had: a balance between sword and scripture, between faith and fortune. And yet, this balance was fragile. Some in the church began to question whether so much wealth could remain holy. How could men sworn to poverty command fleets, estates, and treasuries greater than those of kings? Even some Templars whispered doubts in the stillness of the cloisters. The Red Cross still shone with purity, but shadows had begun to gather beneath it. In the Holy Land, peace was never more than an illusion. Truces came and went. Kings and sultans negotiated and betrayed each other in turn. The Templars remained loyal, disciplined, unshaken, but the world around them was growing tired. The Crusades, once a holy fire, were now a slow, smoldering ember. And yet the Templars continued, because they knew nothing else. They were bound by vows older than any kingdom. To fight was their duty, to serve was their life. But faith alone could not shield them from envy, and fortune could not protect them from fate. For though they still prayed in stone halls and rode beneath the Red Cross, the world was changing, and soon the same power that had raised them up would begin to turn against them. Their glory had reached its height. Their purpose, once pure and shining, would soon be tested in ways they could never have imagined. The 12th century was ending, and with it an age of fragile faith and fading triumphs. The Red Cross of the Templars still flew from the walls of their fortresses, but the world around them had changed. The glory of Jerusalem was gone, replaced by weary coastal cities that clung to survival: Acre, Tyre, and Tripoli. The knights who once guarded pilgrims through holy lands now guarded ruins and empty roads. But the Templars were not men to surrender. They rebuilt, stone by stone, their fortresses rising like silent prayers against the sea wind. In their discipline and devotion, they found strength. Though their numbers had diminished, their resolve had not. To them, the loss of Jerusalem was not the end, but a test, a trial through which their faith would be refined. From the ports of Europe, new crusaders arrived, nobles, mercenaries, and zealots. Some came to fight for God, others for adventure or forgiveness. But most were not like the knights of old. They lacked the discipline, the endurance, the patience that years in the East demanded. The Templars watched them with a quiet sadness. They had seen it before, the arrogance of men who thought courage alone could win wars. But the Holy Land did not forgive pride. Still, the Templars did what they had always done. They trained the new arrivals, supplied them, and stood at their side when the call to battle came. And in those battles, they were once again the iron heart of the Crusades, unflinching, unbreakable, bound by vow and faith. In 1189, the Christians besieged Acre, the great coastal stronghold held by Saladin's forces. The siege lasted 2 years of blood, famine, and plague. The Templars were there from the first day to the last, holding the lines when others broke. They built siege towers, dug trenches, and led charge after charge under a hail of arrows and fire. When Acre finally fell in 1191, it was the Templars who entered first, securing the gates before the army of King Richard the Lionheart poured through. The victory came at a terrible cost, but for a brief moment, hope returned. Acre became the New Jerusalem, the capital of the Crusader states, a city of stone and sea. From its harbor, the white sails of Templar ships carried supplies and men across the Mediterranean. From its walls, the Red Cross watched over a land forever on the edge of war. For a time, there was uneasy peace. King Richard and Saladin, warriors born of the same age, respected each other even as enemies. They fought with fury and negotiated with honor. When Richard finally departed for England, leaving the Holy Land behind, he entrusted much of its defense to the Templars. The knights took the burden without complaint. They fortified Acre, rebuilt castles inland, and guarded the fragile truce that held east and west apart. It was not victory, but it was survival. And for the Templars, survival was enough. Years turned into decades. The world changed, but the wars never truly ended. Every few years, a new crusade rose, called by popes, carried by kings, and often doomed by pride. The Templars remained constant amid the chaos. They fought at Damietta in Egypt, where thousands of crusaders drowned in the Nile. They defended Ascalon and Jaffa, losing and retaking the same cities again and again. They stood against the Mamluks, the fierce slave warriors of Egypt, who now carried the banner of Islam. Each generation of Templars faced a new storm, yet their spirit endured. They prayed, fought, and died, their faith unbroken, their courage unchanged. But faith could not stop time, and the tide of war was turning against them. By the middle of the 13th century, the Muslim powers had grown stronger and more united, while the Christian kingdoms were weak and divided. Europe's kings had lost their appetite for crusade. Trade and politics had replaced piety and sacrifice. The church still spoke of holy war, but its words no longer stirred men's hearts as before. In the East, the Templars held their fortresses alone. They were surrounded by enemies, abandoned by allies, and outnumbered 100 to 1. Their greatest strongholds, Crac des Chevaliers, Chastelblanc, Saft, and Tortosa, stood like islands in a rising sea. Each one was a masterpiece of stone and faith, and each one became a tomb for the men who defended it. The fall came slowly, fortress by fortress. Saft fell first, its defenders massacred after refusing to renounce their vows. Tortosa followed, its walls broken after a long siege. At Crac des Chevaliers, The Templars fought until no man could lift a sword. Even when offered mercy, many chose death. They preferred the sword to dishonor, believing that martyrdom was the truest service they could give. Their courage became legend even among their enemies. A Muslim chronicler once wrote, "Though they were unbelievers, none fought with greater faith than the Templars." By 1291, only one city remained, Acre. It was the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land, a symbol of 2 centuries of hope and sacrifice. The Templars knew what was coming. The Mamluk armies, vast and merciless, had surrounded the city. The sky darkened with smoke as catapults hurled stones against the walls. For weeks, the brothers of the temple fought without rest, manning the ramparts day and night. When the walls finally fell, they retreated to their fortress by the sea, the temple tower, their last refuge. There, surrounded and outnumbered, they made their final stand. The battle raged for hours, the roar of the waves mixing with the clash of steel. In the end, the tower collapsed, burying defenders and attackers alike. Acre was lost. The Crusader dream was over. Those who survived fled by sea, the last Templars of the East, carrying their relics, their records, and their broken hearts. They sailed westward, back to Europe, to lands they had once protected from afar. The Holy Land, which had given them birth, was gone. But the order itself endured. They had lost Jerusalem, Acre, and every fortress of stone, yet they still held something that could not be conquered: faith, discipline, and the immense wealth of their European estates. From those lands, the Templar story would continue, but it would no longer be a story of war. It would become a story of suspicion, envy, and betrayal. For the world that awaited them in the West was not the one they had left behind. And soon, the red cross that had once inspired awe would become a mark of danger in the eyes of kings. The age of crusades was ending. The age of power and persecution was about to begin. The sea carried them home, wary men in white cloaks, no longer conquerors or heroes, but survivors. The year was 1291, and the last walls of Acre had fallen into fire and ruin. The Holy Land was gone. For the first time in nearly 2 centuries, the Knights Templar had no Jerusalem to defend, no enemy to face, no cause that could give shape to their lives. When their ships reached the shores of Cyprus, the survivors knelt in silence. They had left behind their dead, their fortresses, their relics, everything except the vows that still bound them to God and to one another. Their order was not broken, but it was changed forever. They were warriors without a war, guardians without a gate. Cyprus became their refuge, a small island, green and fertile, but far from the sacred dust of Palestine. There, the Templars rebuilt what they could. They established commanderies, trained new recruits, repaired ships, and waited for a new crusade that would never come. They spoke often of returning to Jerusalem. They prayed for it daily, believing that God would someday open the path again. But deep inside, many knew that the dream was dying. The world had moved on. Europe no longer burned with holy fire. Kings had grown cautious, popes more political. The crusading spirit had given way to diplomacy, commerce, and ambition. Even the pilgrims who once braved deserts for a glimpse of the holy city now traveled instead to local shrines closer to home. The age of faith was dimming, and with it, the light that had guided the Templars for generations. Yet in this new world, the Templars still held immense power. Their estates covered thousands of acres of farmland, vineyards, and villages. Their treasuries contained more gold than any kingdom in Europe. They still managed the debts of nobles, guarded royal treasures, and maintained their network of fortresses and commanderies. From Portugal to Scotland, from Italy to Hungary, the white mantles of the Templars still appeared in every city. They trained, prayed, and worked with the same discipline as before. Their rule had not changed, but their purpose had. No longer soldiers in a holy war, they had become administrators and bankers, keepers of wealth and secrets. Their hands, once hardened by sword and shield, now turned the pages of ledgers and contracts. The world saw them as powerful, but the brothers themselves felt hollow. For without the Holy Land, what was the temple? It was in these years of exile that the Templars became surrounded by mystery. They were everywhere, yet apart. They owned vast lands but lived modestly. They spoke little, moved quietly, and answered to no king or bishop, only to their Grand Master, and through him, the Pope himself. Their independence, once their strength, now made others uneasy. Whispers began to spread. What secrets did they guard behind the walls of their preceptories? Why did no outsider ever attend their secret meetings or see the rituals of their initiation? Stories grew wild in taverns and courts alike. Some claimed the Templars possessed the Holy Grail, the cup used by Christ at the Last Supper. Others said they had discovered hidden knowledge beneath the ruins of Solomon's temple, ancient wisdom forbidden by the Church. There were rumors of golden idols, strange prayers, and midnight ceremonies. Most of it was fantasy, born of ignorance and envy. But such stories have power, especially when whispered in the ears of kings who owe money to those they fear. In France, that king was Philip Eve, known as Philip the Fair, handsome, proud, and ruthless. He ruled with iron will and constant debt. His wars with England and Flanders had drained the treasury. His crown glittered, but his coffers were empty, and the Templars were his creditors. For years, Philip had borrowed vast sums from the temple in Paris, gold to fund armies, pay soldiers, and maintain his royal court. Each time, the brothers lent without question. They did not judge him. They only recorded what was owed. But to a king, even honest debt can feel like chains. Philip began to resent their power. The temple's fortress in Paris was stronger than his own palace. Their influence reached every noble house in France. And worst of all, they answered not to him, but to the Pope. He could not fight them with swords, so he began to plot with shadows. Meanwhile, within the order itself, change continued. The Grand Master at the time, Jacques de Molay, was an aging warrior who had fought in the East and still believed in the purity of the temple's mission. He saw the rumors and the shifting world, but refused to bend to fear. To him, the Templars' duty was unchanged, to serve God in obedience and honor. Under his leadership, the order remained strong but cautious. They focused on rebuilding their naval power, strengthening ties with the Hospitallers, and maintaining their holdings in Europe. Molay still dreamed of a new crusade, one last chance to reclaim the Holy Land and restore the purpose that had defined their lives. But he could not see the danger growing around him. The enemy he would face next was not across the sea, but within Christendom itself. The Church, too, had changed. Popes came and went, each entangled in politics and pressure from kings. The papacy had moved to Avignon, under the shadow of France. Its authority was still great, but its independence had weakened. And in this fragile balance, Philip V saw his opportunity. He began to spread quiet doubts about the Templars, their wealth, their secrecy, their supposed arrogance. He suggested to the Pope that the order had grown corrupt, that they no longer served God, but their own hidden interests. In time, these whispers would grow into accusations, and accusations into a plan. But for now, the Templars went about their lives unaware. They prayed, trained, and managed their estates. They believed their reputation, earned through centuries of sacrifice, would protect them. They could not imagine that Christendom itself would turn against them. The Templars had survived the deserts of the East, the fall of Jerusalem, and the wrath of Saladin. They had faced death with faith and stood unbroken before countless enemies. But the storm that was coming would not strike from the battlefield. It would rise from the very heart of the world they had sworn to defend. For now, the order still stood tall, disciplined, wealthy, and proud. But beneath the calm surface, the shadows were gathering. The kingdom of God was gone, and in its place, a kingdom of shadows was about to take its place. And in those shadows, the fate of the Templars was being sealed. not by sword or siege, but by betrayal. The years after the fall of Acre were, strangely, both the Templars' most prosperous and their most perilous. From the outside, it seemed that the loss of the Holy Land had not weakened them, but refined them. Their power had shifted, no longer forged by the sword, but by influence, by trust, and by gold. Across Europe, their Red Cross still commanded respect. Their fortresses still dotted the landscape like silent witnesses of faith. Their commanderies hummed with activity. Horses trained in the courtyards, monks copied records by candlelight, and travelers sought shelter behind Templar walls. In every major city of Christendom, there stood a temple: Paris, London, Lisbon, Venice, each one a fortress, a treasury, and a sanctuary. For those who saw only their surface, the order seemed untouchable. They were the guardians of wealth, the keepers of secrets, and the last living symbol of the crusading age. It was during this time that Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, presided over what would become both the height of their prosperity and the beginning of their end. He was a man of courage and faith, one of the last who had fought in the East, scarred by desert winds and the memory of battles long lost. He believed that the Templars still had a divine mission, even if Jerusalem was gone. Under his leadership, the order turned its strength toward Europe. Their ships carried goods and people across the Mediterranean. Their estates produced grain, wine, and wool that filled the markets of cities from Marseille to Bruges. They lent money to monarchs, financed cathedrals, and acted as mediators between rival lords. The Templars had become indispensable, not just as warriors, but as the administrators of a continent. And yet, with each passing year, the world they had built grew more entangled with the ambitions of kings. Among all those kings, none watched them more closely than Philip of France. He had inherited a kingdom that was powerful, but deeply in debt. His wars with England and Flanders had drained his treasury, and his lavish court consumed what little remained. He had already taxed the clergy, banished the Jews to seize their property, and even imprisoned moneylenders to fill his coffers. But none of it was enough. There was one group left untouched, one that possessed more gold than the crown itself: the Temple. Philip knew that the Templars held immense reserves of wealth in their fortress in Paris: gold, silver, jewels, and the deposits of nobles who trusted no one else. He had borrowed heavily from them to fund his wars, and the debt had become a chain he could not bear. To pay them back would bankrupt him. To destroy them would free him. And so, quietly, he began to lay the foundations of betrayal. At first, his campaign was subtle. He whispered to his advisors that the Templars had grown arrogant. He questioned whether an order of monks should wield such influence over kings. And soon, darker rumors began to spread, stories of heresy, of strange rituals performed behind closed doors, of hidden idols and blasphemous oaths. The Templars, bound by secrecy and discipline, offered no defense. They ignored the gossip, believing their reputation would speak for itself. But Philip's words reached eager ears. In a time when fear of heresy haunted every corner of Europe, such accusations were deadly. He knew that if he could convince the Church of their guilt, he could justify seizing their property and erasing their name. Meanwhile, the Templars continued their work, unaware of the net closing around them. They maintained order in their lands, lent to princes, and advised popes. Their ships carried pilgrims to Cyprus and traders to the ports of Italy. Their treasury in Paris, guarded like a fortress within a fortress, held the wealth of Europe itself. Even the Pope, Clement V, relied on them. He had moved the papacy to Avignon, deep within Philip's shadow, and found himself caught between gratitude and fear. He owed the Templars his protection, but he owed Philip his throne, and Philip knew it. By the early 1300s, the balance of power in Europe had shifted. The crusading dream was dead, the church was divided, and kings had grown too powerful to fear excommunication. The world no longer bowed to faith, it bowed to gold. For the Templars, this new reality was dangerous. They were an institution built on obedience to God, not to kings. Their independence, once admired, now seemed like defiance. To monarchs who ruled by fear and control, the order was an affront, a state within a state, an army that answered to no one but the Pope. Their very virtues, discipline, secrecy, and loyalty had become their weaknesses. In 1305, Grand Master Jacques de Molay traveled to France at the Pope's request. He came to discuss the unification of the Templars with their rivals, the Hospitallers, a proposal meant to strengthen the defense of the faith. De Molay was cautious but respectful. He knew the order could not endure without purpose. He did not know that his journey would lead him into a trap. Philip received him warmly. The king smiled, promised friendship, and praised the Templars for their service to the crown. Molay believed him. He had no reason not to. For nearly 200 years, the temple had been loyal to every pope and king it served. It had fought for God, blood for Christendom, and never betrayed its vows. But in Philip's eyes, loyalty meant nothing. He saw only gold and opportunity. While the Grand Master met with the Pope in Avignon, Philip's spies gathered evidence, or what they called evidence. False witnesses, forged confessions, and twisted rumors were prepared in secret. The accusations were grotesque. The Templars denied Christ, spat on the cross, and worshipped idols in the darkness. To question the charges was to risk one's life. By the time de Molay returned to Paris in 1307, the trap was ready. The Pope hesitated, unsure, torn between justice and fear. Philip did not wait for his permission. On a quiet autumn morning, while the Grand Master prayed in the chapel of the temple, royal soldiers surrounded the fortress. Across France, the same order was carried out. Templars were seized in every city, every village, every commandery. The king had struck. What followed would become one of the darkest chapters in history, an act not of war, but of betrayal. The Templars' golden age had come to an end. Their faith would be tested in dungeons instead of deserts, and their blood would be spilled not on battlefields, but upon the stones of Paris. The red cross that had once shone as a symbol of courage and purity was about to be stained with the ashes of its own brotherhood. The golden years of power were over. What remained was fire, confession, and the long silence of the grave. Before dawn broke on Friday, October 13th, 1307, the city of Paris slept beneath a veil of mist. Its cobbled streets were still, the bells of Notre Dame silent. But beyond the fog, shadows moved, soldiers in armor, whispering commands, sealing gates, surrounding the great fortress of the temple. The orders came directly from King Philip Evie of France, Philip the Fair, a ruler admired for his beauty and feared for his will. By sunrise, his command would be known across all of France. Every Knight Templar, from the highest master to the humblest servant, was to be arrested, their property seized, their secrets exposed, their order destroyed. In a single morning, a brotherhood that had stood for nearly 200 years was erased from public life. Within the massive walls of the Paris temple, Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, was leading morning prayers when the soldiers burst through the gates. They carried royal warrants, stamped with the seal of France, and backed by the might of the crown. Molay, bewildered but calm, did not resist. He believed it to be a misunderstanding, perhaps a matter of taxes or land disputes. The order had faced envy before. It had nothing to hide. But as he was bound in chains and led away through the mist, he saw the same scene unfolding across the courtyard. Knights dragged from their quarters, scribes clutching holy books, servants trembling as soldiers overturned chests of gold and parchment. The Templars did not fight. They had taken vows of obedience, and they obeyed, even now, as the world they knew collapsed around them. By noon, hundreds of brothers were imprisoned in Paris alone. By nightfall, thousands more were in chains throughout France. The king's men moved swiftly, guided by lists prepared in secret for months. Every commandery, Every farm, every church belonging to the temple was seized. Their treasuries were sealed, their letters and ledgers confiscated. The charges, when announced, shocked even their enemies: heresy, blasphemy, idolatry, unnatural acts. Philip's ministers claimed the Templars had abandoned the faith, that during their secret rites they spat on the cross, denied Christ, and worshipped a demon called Baphomet. It was absurd, but the word spread like wildfire. In an age where heresy was feared more than death, accusation was almost as deadly as proof. The king presented himself as the defender of Christendom. He claimed he acted not from greed, but from piety, that he was purging corruption from a once holy order. But those who knew him saw the truth in his eyes. Philip the Fair was a man of marble, beautiful, cold, and unyielding. He loved gold and control above all things, and now both lay within his grasp. With the Templars imprisoned, their vast wealth fell under royal custody. Temples, estates, and fortresses were emptied under the guise of investigation. The same gold that had once funded crusades now filled the king's treasuries. And as for their secrets, those were reshaped to suit his purpose. The interrogations began within days. In the dungeons of Paris, torches flickered against damp stone. The air was thick with smoke, fear, and the sound of chains. The Templars were men of discipline, trained to endure pain and silence. But the torturers of Philip's Inquisition were patient. They worked not with swords, but with fire, rope, and the slow breaking of will. One by one, the brothers confessed, not to truth, but to whatever would make the pain stop. They admitted to things they had never imagined: denying Christ, worshiping idols, kissing the devil's image. Under torture, even the strongest faith can falter. And the king's scribes recorded every word as proof of guilt. Those who refused were left to die in the darkness, their names erased from the records. The church, at first, hesitated. Pope Clement V, still bound to the Templars by loyalty and faith, demanded that no such action should have been taken without his consent. He summoned envoys, protested the arrests, and insisted the Templars be tried under church law, not by royal decree. But Philip's reach was long. He surrounded the Pope with pressure, political, financial, and even spiritual. The papal seat itself was now in Avignon, within French influence. Clement's words carried less power than the king's armies. In the end, the Pope agreed to cooperate, convinced that it was better to oversee the trials than to lose all authority over them. It was a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Months turned into years. Across Europe, the Templars awaited judgment. Some regions, like England and Portugal, hesitated to follow France's example. Their kings, though cautious, did not believe the charges. In Spain, Templars continued to serve in wars against the Moors. But Philip's influence was relentless, and soon the papal decree spread through Christendom. Every Templar, in every land, was to be arrested and interrogated. The once mighty order was reduced to whispers and ashes. In 1310, a few brave brothers attempted to defend the temple's name. They recanted their confessions, declaring they had been forced to lie under torture. They begged to be heard in open trial, to stand before the church and testify in truth. Their courage was met with fire. 54 knights were declared relapsed heretics and burned alive outside Paris. Their ashes rose into the air like the smoke of forgotten prayers. The Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, watched in silence from his cell. He knew then that the temple's end was sealed, not by battle, but by betrayal. By 1312, the Pope formally dissolved the order of the temple. Its properties were transferred to the Hospitallers, though much of its treasure remained in royal hands. Its members were dispersed, some imprisoned, some executed, many simply vanished. A few fled to distant lands, carrying the memory of the Red Cross with them. The temple was no more. But justice, like faith, cannot be buried forever. For even as the flames of persecution faded, the truth began to whisper through the centuries that the Templars had not fallen because of sin, but because they stood too close to power. And so ended the age of the king of iron and gold, a man who ruled with both sword and greed. Philip IV had destroyed the order that had once defended Christendom itself, not for faith, but for fortune. His victory was complete. Yet history would not remember him as a savior. His line would die out within a generation, his dynasty consumed by the same cold ambition that had driven him to ruin others. As for Jacques de Molay, his story was not yet over. For though the temple had been destroyed, its grand master still lived, and his final words would echo far beyond the flames. The year was 1314, and winter still lingered over Paris. Along the river Seine, the wind carried the smell of wood smoke and the sound of distant bells. But that morning, the city awoke to a different kind of silence, a silence heavy with dread. After 7 long years of imprisonment, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Jacques de Molay, was to face judgment. Once a warrior of the Holy Land, now an old man with silver hair and worn hands, he was brought from his cell in the tower of the temple, the very fortress that had once been his home, his command, and his pride. He walked slowly, head unbowed, wrapped in a tattered cloak marked faintly with the red cross. He was not alone. With him stood Geoffroy de Charny, preceptor of Normandy, another high-ranking brother who had endured the same years of confinement, the same interrogations, and the same humiliation. Both men had been broken in body, but not in spirit. They were led to a platform before the great cathedral of Notre Dame, where royal and clerical judges awaited them. For 7 years, the trials had dragged on, endless hearings, forced confessions, and false witnesses. The church had already dissolved the order, but the final word on its leaders had been delayed. King Philip wanted a confession that would justify the destruction of the temple once and for all. The Pope, wary and uncertain, wanted peace. The people wanted truth, though few dared to believe they would hear it. As Molay stood before his accusers, the charges were read once more: heresy, idolatry, blasphemy, corruption. It was a familiar litany, one he had heard 1,000 times. The judges expected him to repeat his confession, to accept guilt and ask for forgiveness. It would be the easiest path, the safest one. But after 7 years of silence, the old knight lifted his head. In a calm, steady voice, Jacques de Molay spoke not to the judges, but to the crowd gathered beyond them, to the people of Paris, to history itself. "I confess," he said, "that I have been guilty only of lies forced from me by fear and torment. I have betrayed my brothers and my faith to save a life that was no longer mine to keep. For that I repent." A murmur swept through the square. The judges froze. Molay continued, "The order of the temple is pure. Its vows were sacred. Never did we deny our Lord, nor commit the crimes of which we are accused. We have been betrayed by envy and by greed, and God knows the truth." The silence that followed was absolute. Then de Charny stepped forward beside him and said simply, "I believe every word our Grand Master has spoken. We die as faithful servants of Christ." It was an act of defiance, quiet, measured, but more powerful than any army. The judges panicked. Their orders were to close the trial with confession, not rebellion. Philip's men rushed from the platform to the palace, seeking instructions. The king, upon hearing what had happened, flew into a rage. "Then let them have what they desire." He is said to have shouted, "They shall die as they have lived, obstinate and unrepentant." There would be no more trials, no more delays. Before the sun set, the Grand Master of the Templars and his brother knight were to be burned alive. As dusk fell, the people of Paris gathered along the banks of the Seine. At the small island between the bridges, the Pile des Juifs, the Isle of the Jews, a pyre had been built of oak and pitch. Soldiers ringed it with torches. The river glowed red beneath the firelight. Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charny were brought forth one last time. They were offered mercy if they would recant. Both refused. Molay's voice carried over the crackling of the flames. God knows who is wrong and has sinned, he said. Soon he shall judge those who have judged us. To him I commit my soul and the souls of my brothers. He was tied to the stake, facing west, toward the setting sun. Some said he asked to face Notre Dame, to look upon the house of God as he died. Others said he prayed not for himself, but for France. When the flames rose, he did not scream. He lifted his bound hands toward the sky and prayed aloud until the smoke swallowed his words. Geoffroy de Charny died beside him, head bowed, whispering a psalm. The crowd was silent. Even the soldiers hesitated to move. Something sacred had happened, something they did not fully understand. As the fire consumed the last Grand Master of the temple, a chill wind swept through Paris. Those who were there would later swear that Molay's voice echoed above the roar of the flames, calling down a curse. Pope Clement? King Philip, before the year is out, I summon you both to appear before God's tribunal, to answer for what you have done. It was only a rumor, or perhaps divine irony, but before a year had passed, both men were dead. Pope Clement V died in April, tormented by illness. King Philip followed in November, thrown from his horse during a hunt. His sons, too, would die without heirs. Within a generation, the line of Capetian kings, one of the proudest dynasties of Europe, was gone. The people whispered that the curse of the Templars had been fulfilled, but history is rarely so neat. What is certain is this: on that cold evening in March 1314, the fire that consumed Jacques de Molay did not destroy the spirit of the temple. If anything, it set it free. The Templars had built a world of faith and courage, one that kings and inquisitors could not erase. Their discipline, their architecture, their ideals of loyalty and justice would echo through the centuries. In the silence after the flames, the myth of the temple began to grow, no longer a living order, but an eternal legend. They had perished as men, but lived on as mystery. And sometimes mystery is stronger than any sword. As the ashes cooled on the river's edge, a single red cross fluttered in the wind, torn from the cloak of one who had died with honor. It drifted over the water, then vanished beneath the current, carried away into history, into the stories that would one day be told by candlelight in the long dark hours before sleep. For though the temple had fallen, the world would never forget the men who prayed with their swords, who built fortresses for faith, and who faced the fire without fear. They were gone, but not lost. The flames that consumed Jacques de Molay marked not only the end of the Knights Templar, but the birth of their legend. The fire burned away their bodies, their banners, and their walls of stone, yet something survived, something stronger than armies and older than kings. It was faith, it was mystery, it was memory. And from that memory, 1,000 stories were born. In the years that followed the Grand Master's death, whispers moved like wind through the kingdoms of Europe. Some said a few Templars had escaped the arrests, that they had fled France before Philip's soldiers arrived, carrying secret documents and treasures aboard their ships. According to one tale, a fleet had vanished from the port of La Rochelle on the very night of the arrests, disappearing into the mist and never seen again. Where they went, no one could say. Portugal claimed they came south, where King Denis, a ruler both wise and cautious, refused to condemn them. He formed a new order in 1319, the Order of Christ, which took over Templar lands but continued their traditions in secret. In Spain, the Knights of Aragon were folded into the Order of Montesa, and in Germany, fragments of the temple joined the Teutonic Knights. In England and Scotland, many simply melted into the fabric of the church, their vows unspoken but unbroken. The order had fallen. Yet its spirit had scattered like embers carried by the wind, settling quietly into new lands, new names, new forms. But it was in legend, not politics, that the Templars found eternal life. Their story of faith betrayed, of courage punished, of secrets buried, ignited the imagination of centuries to come. Poets sang of their lost treasure. Chroniclers spoke of the curse of Molay, Philosophers wrote of their discipline, their knowledge, their mysterious silence, and in time, mystery became myth. Some said the Templars had guarded the Holy Grail, the cup of Christ that gave eternal life. Others believed they had discovered secret wisdom beneath the ruins of Solomon's temple, ancient truths that could bridge heaven and earth. There were tales of underground vaults, of sacred geometry, of hidden codes carved into cathedrals and fortresses. Historians dismissed such stories as fantasy, yet the myth endured, because it spoke to something deeper than fact. It spoke of a yearning for purity and power, for honor and faith, for the impossible balance between the sword and the soul. Through the centuries, the Red Cross returned in unexpected ways. When the Freemasons emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries, builders and philosophers of the modern age, they looked to the Templars as spiritual ancestors. Their rituals echoed the oaths of the ancient order: secrecy, brotherhood, truth. Their symbols, the compass, the square, the temple, carried the same longing for order and divine structure. It is said that when a Mason builds, he builds not only in stone, but in spirit, just as the Templars once did when they raised their fortresses in the name of God. In truth, there was no direct line from the temple to the lodge, but there was a shared inheritance, the belief that men could dedicate themselves to something higher than themselves. That discipline could be sacred. That light could live even in darkness. And what of the church that had condemned them? Over time, even it came to question its role in their fall. Popes and scholars centuries later would admit that the Templars had been wronged, destroyed not for heresy, but for their independence, their wealth, and their refusal to bend to royal power. Their ashes had long turned to dust, yet their innocence became a matter of history, not rumor. Justice, slow but certain, had arrived, not through courts, but through time itself. In France, the place of Molé's execution, the Pays des Juifs, the Isle of the Jews, was renamed the Pays des Templiers, the Isle of the Templars. Today, it is part of the city's beating heart. Few who cross its bridges know that beneath their feet, the fire of betrayal once burned bright. But for those who remember, it remains hallowed ground. Even now, on certain nights, when the mist rises from the Seine, the locals say you can still hear the echo of a man's voice, carried by the wind. God knows who is wrong and has sinned. Centuries passed. Kingdoms rose and fell, empires crumbled, and the Red Cross faded from battlefields. But the idea behind it, courage in service, faith in action, silence in sacrifice, survived. Every generation found something of itself in the story of the Templars. For some, they were symbols of lost purity. For others, of rebellion against corruption. And for a few, of mystery, of hidden truths waiting to be rediscovered. From painters to novelists, from explorers to dreamers, their image persisted. Even in the modern world, an age of reason and light, the Templar legend refused to die. In quiet moments, one might imagine Jacques de Molay standing once more on that riverbank, the flames behind him and eternity before him. He does not curse, he does not fear. He looks instead toward the city, toward the future, and whispers the same words that once guided his brothers: non nobis domine, non nobis sed nomine tu de gloriam. Not unto us, O Lord, not unto us, but to your name be the glory. It was their prayer, their battle cry, and their final benediction. And perhaps that is why they are never truly gone. For the Templars were not only knights of the past, they were an idea that duty can be sacred, that courage can outlast fear, and that faith, when pure, can never truly be extinguished. Today, their symbols remain carved in the stones of Europe. Crosses, swords, and circles half, hidden in old cathedrals and forgotten ruins. But their true legacy lies not in relics or treasure, but in the hearts of those who still believe in something greater than themselves. For every soul who stands firm in the face of injustice, for every voice that speaks truth though it may burn, the spirit of the temple lives again, and perhaps, somewhere beyond the reach of kings and popes, The brothers of the Red Cross still ride, not through deserts or battlefields, but through memory itself, guarding what cannot be taken, and keeping faith alive in the quiet corners of the human heart. Thank you for joining us tonight here at Silent History Secrets. If this story has carried you through the quiet hours and helped you find a moment of peace, please take a moment to subscribe so you'll never miss the next journey into the past. Until we meet again, sleep well, dream gently. And remember, every whisper of history has its secret.